Hello everyone, in this video we will see how to create client-side scripts for validating web form controls using DHTML. I have been utilizing NetBeans in previous exercises, but I decided to switch to Eclipse as my primary IDE. In our previous examples, we have already covered about the process of creating HTML, CSS and JavaScript files in NetBeans in detail. So please follow the same steps if you are using NetBeans. Now to do this project in Eclipse, launch the Eclipse IDE. Please remember to start the Apache Tomcat server before running your project in Eclipse. This is essential for your application to function properly. If you need a refresher on how to set up and run the Tomcat server, refer to the video in our playlist. I will upload a separate video for installation of Eclipse. Also, I provided a link to Eclipse download page in description. Make use of it. Now let's explore how to create client-side scripts for validating web form controls using DHTML. DHTML is a combination of HTML, CSS and JavaScript. It allows us to create interactive and dynamic web pages. And client-side validation helps us to ensure that the data entered in the web forms is correct and complete before it is sent to the server. And this provides immediate feedback to the users, improve user experience. Also, it reduces the number of errors and server requests. In this exercise, we will create HTML form, style the form, and implement JavaScript validation. Finally, we test the validation. This HTML document creates a simple contact form that includes fields for username, email address, and checkbox for terms and conditions. It also includes error message placeholders for form validation feedback. And this form is styled using external CSS file and has a client-side validation implemented through a separate JavaScript file. First, we start with the document type declaration and opening HTML tag. This tells the browser that we are using HTML5, which is the latest standard. It ensures our document is rendered correctly. This attribute specifies that our document is in English, which is great for accessibility. Now let's look at the head section. This ensures that our document can display a wide range of characters, including special symbols. The viewport meta tag is essential for responsive design. It makes sure our form looks good on all devices, whether it is a phone or a desktop. This part sets the width of the viewport to the width of the device's screen. This part sets the initial zoom level when the page is first loaded by the browser. A value of 1.0 means the page is displayed in normal size without any zoom. Title tag sets the title of our page. You will see in the browser tab. Finally, we link our external CSS file. This is where the magic of styling happens. Moving on to the body of our document, we have a div element that serves as a container for our form. The div has a class attribute which is set to form container. The purpose of this class is to apply specific styles to the container, which allow us to control its appearance and layout on the page. By grouping our form element within this container, we can easily manage spacing, background color, borders, and other styling properties. The h1 tag gives our form a title. It is important to have a clear heading so users know what the form is for. Now let's get into the form itself. We start with the form element, which contains all form fields. Inside the form, each input field is enclosed with div element that has the class form group. By using form group class, we can apply consistent styling, spacing and layout to each input field and its associated label. The form contains 4 form groups, each with a label, input field and an error message span. The form ID equals contact form element is a form itself. It has an ID of contact form, which can be used to reference the form in JavaScript. NoValidate is a HTML5 attribute for form elements. When present, it tells the browser not to perform its built-in validation on form inputs. Let's see what happens if this attribute is not included. You can see the browser will perform its own built-in form validation. Now let's see the form groups. The first form group contains a label for username field and an input field of type text with an ID of username. And we have a span element with an ID of username error to display the error message. In this line, label tag is a HTML element which is used to define a label for an input element in a form. It helps to describe what the input field is for. The for attribute in label tag associates the label with a specific input field. In this case, for equals username means that this label is linked to an input field that has ID attribute set to username. The text username inside the label is what the user sees on the web page. It tells users that they need to enter their username in corresponding input field. So when user clicks on the label text username, The browser will automatically focus on the input field with the ID username. This is because the for attribute creates a connection between label and the input field. The input tag is a HTML element used to create interactive controls in web form where user can enter data. The type attribute specifies the kind of input control. In this case, type equals text, which means that this input field is for entering plain text, which allows user to type any type of text they want. The ID attribute specifies a unique identifier for input field. In this case, the ID attribute is set to username, which means that this input field can be referenced by JavaScript or CSS using the ID username. Next, the name attribute specifies the name of the input field, which is sent to the server when the form is submitted. In this case, name attribute is also set to username, which means that the value entered in this input field will be sent to the server as a parameter named username. The required attribute specifies that the input field must be filled before the form is submitted. If the user tries to submit the form without entering the value in this field, the browser will display error message prompting them to fill it. Next, the span tag. It is an inline container used to group inline elements in a document. It doesn't represent anything specific, but it is often used to apply styles or manipulate text. In this case, it is used to display an error message related to username input. The ID attribute gives this particular span a unique identifier, which is username error. In this case, the ID attribute is set to username error, which means that this span element can be referenced by JavaScript or CSS using the ID username error. The class attribute assigns a class name to the span, which is error. This class can be used to apply specific styles like color or font to an element. Typically, elements with a class error might be styled to show that something went wrong, and often using red text to indicate an error. Here the span is currently empty, that is, there is no text between opening and closing span tags. And it is designed to hold an error message that will be displayed to the user when there is an issue with their username input, like if it's too short or already taken. So when user enters an invalid value in username input field, JavaScript code can dynamically update the content of this span element to display an error message, such as invalid username or username is required. So this part of code creates a single input field for a user to enter their username. The form includes a label, an input field, and a span element to display error message. The required attribute ensures that the user must enter a value in the input field before submitting the form. Now let's look at this part of code. This section is quite similar to the username label as we discussed earlier. Just like the username input, we have a form group which organizes our form elements neatly. Here we have a label for email input that says email address. And this part specifies that the input must be valid email format. The required attribute ensures that the user must fill out this field before submitting the form. This part is a placeholder for displaying error message related to email input. So this section will create a label, an input field for entering email address, and a span element to display error message. The input field is required, meaning that the user must enter a value before submitting the form. Next up, we have a div element with class of form group. This groups the checkbox and label. First, we have checkbox input field. This line creates an input element with following attributes. Type checkbox means the input field should be checkbox. The checkbox allows the user to select or deselect an option. In this case, to agree the terms. This part is unique identifier for checkbox. The ID helps to link the checkbox to its label, and it allows JavaScript or CSS to easily refer to this checkbox. Name equals terms means name given to this checkbox. When the form is submitted, the name is used to identify the checkbox value. If the checkbox is checked, the value will be sent to the form data. The required attribute indicates that the checkbox must be checked before the form is submitted. Next, we have label element with a for attribute set to terms. This associates the label with the checkbox input field that has an ID of terms. The label element contains the text I agree to the terms and conditions and a link to term and condition page. The link is created using a element with the following attributes. href equals hash. This is a link URL. In this case, suggest hash symbol, which indicates that link doesn't go anywhere. Target equals blank. This indicates that the link should open in a new tab or window. Next, the span element with ID of terms error and class of error is created. This element is used to display error message related to terms checkbox input field. So this part of code creates a checkbox input field, a label with a link to the terms and condition page, and a span element to display error message. The checkbox input field is required, meaning the user must check the box before submitting the form. Next, we have a div element with class of form group. This container has a submit button. This code creates a button element with type attribute set to submit. When it is clicked, this button submits the form data to the server. The button element contains the text submit. And this tag closes the form element that was opened earlier, which indicates the end of the form. Similarly, this tag closes the div element, which wrap around the entire form. Next up, we have script tag. This is used to include a JavaScript in an HTML document. This attribute specifies the source of the JavaScript file. In this case, it points to a file named script.js. By linking to an external JavaScript file, you can keep your HTML clean and separate the logic from the structure. The script tag is placed before the closing body tag. So by placing the script at the end of the body, it ensures that the HTML content loads first before the JavaScript runs. This tag closes the body section and this tag closes the entire HTML document. These are all the HTML structure. This is the form container and this is the form element. These are all the form groups. Form group has error messages. So this code will create a simple contact form with 3 input field, username, email and terms agreement. Also a submit button. The form is wrapped in div container and has error span elements for each input field. The JavaScript file contains code to validate form input and provide feedback to the user. Now we have CSS code which styles the contact form. It defines basic styles for HTML elements such as font family and background color for the body, container styles for the form, typography for headings and labels, styles for input fields that is text, email and checkbox, error message styles, and button styles including hover effect. This makes the text look like Arial font. If Arial is not available on the user device, the browser will automatically use the similar sans serif font like Helvetica or Calibri instead. This line sets the background color to a light blue. Next, the form container. Here we limit the width of the form to 400 pixels and centers it on the page. So this line will center the container horizontally. And we add 50 pixels of space inside the container. And we set the background color of the form to white. Next, we add yellow border around the container. So the border property defines the border of an element with width of 2 pixels. Solid is the style of the border. That is, the border will be a solid line. It also includes dashed, dotted, double, rich, inset, outset and groove. This is the color of the border, which is hex code for yellow. Next, we give the container slightly rounded corners. So this line will create a smooth rounded corners. And the value determines the amount of curvature. This line adds a shadow effect to create lifted appearance. So this property allows you to add shadow effect to an element. These two zeros are horizontal and vertical offset values. In this case, both are set to 0, which means the shadow will be directly behind the element with no offset. 10 pixel means blur radius of shadow. A larger value will create a more blurred shadow, while smaller value will create a sharper shadow. Next, RGBA of 0, 0, 0, 0.1. This is the color of the shadow. RGBA stands for red, green, blue, alpha. 0, 0, 0 represents the RGB value of the color. In this case, black. 0.1 represents the alpha channel value, which controls the opacity of the color. So the value 0.1 means the shadow will be 10% opaque and 90% transparent. Next, we have heading. This line centers the heading text and sets the color to a deep rich red. This line adds the space below each form group. Next, we have label element and it applies two styles. Display property controls the layout of an element. Display equals block means it makes the label act like a block. So here think of a block as a box. It takes up the whole width of the space. It starts on new line and pushes everything else down. With this, label will always be above the input field like title above a box. And if you don't set display to block, it will default to inline, causing the labels and input field to appear side by side. But now it appears one by one because the input box width is set to 100%. Let me change the width to 20%. And you can see without display block, it appears side by side. Margin bottom equals 5 pixel means it adds 5 pixel space below each label. That is, it creates separation between label and its associated input field. Next we have input fields. The input elements with type attribute is set to text, and again the input element with type attribute is set to email. The comma between two selectors is a way to group them together. Here the comma serves as a grouping operator. It will allow you to apply the same style to multiple selectors without repeating the style definitions. So when you use comma to separate selectors, you are telling the browser to apply the same styles to each selector. Now the styles defined within the curly brackets will be applied to both types of input fields. Next, width equals 100%. This makes the input fields stretch to the full width of the container. Let me change the value and see what happens. If I set the width of input field to 10%, it looks narrow and affect their appearance and usability. So use larger percentage for input field such as 50%, 70% or even 100%. And when I set the width of the input field to 200%, input field will be twice as wide as its parent container. Add padding of 10 pixel to the input element. This will create some space between the text and the border. Padding is the space between the content of an element and its border. Padding equals 10 pixel means it applies 10 pixels of padding to all four sides. That is top, right, bottom and left. Let me change the value and see what happens. I am adding 10 pixel and 20 pixel. This will apply 10 pixel to the top and bottom and 20 pixel to left and right. And if I apply 10 pixel, 20 pixel and 30 pixel, it applies 10 pixel to the top, 20 pixel to the left and right and 30 pixel to the bottom. And if I make it to 10, 20, 30 and 40, it applies padding in the order of top, right, bottom and left. This line will set the border of input element to 1 pixel. 1 pixel is the border width, solid is border style, and this color code is light gray color. This line sets the border radius of an input element to 4 pixel, which will create a slightly rounded corner effect. Next we have input element with type attribute set to checkbox. This line sets the right margin of checkbox input element to 5 pixel, which means there will be 5 pixel gap between the checkbox and the next element to its right. Let me see what happens if I change to 1 pixel. You can see the difference, it creates a very small amount of space. These codes style error messages. Color equals red. It sets the text color to red, which is commonly used to indicate errors or warnings. This line sets the font size to 12 pixels, which makes the error message relatively small. These code snippets targets invalid inputs in form. Also we set the border color to red. Therefore this CSS rule will apply red border color to any input field that has an invalid value. The selector input equals invalid targets the input element that does not meet the validation criteria defined in its attribute. This helps to indicate the user that their input is invalid. This selector will be applied if the required field is left empty, it will be considered invalid. And if an input type like email or number does not match the expected format, it becomes invalid. Also, if a field has pattern attribute and the input does not match that pattern, it is also invalid. Moving further, these code styles a button element. So this selector targets all button elements on a page. This line sets the button's width to 100% of its parent container, making it full width button. This line adds 10 pixel of padding to the button, which makes it slightly larger and more clickable. This sets the button's background color to greenish hue. This line sets the text color of button to white. This line removes the default border color from the button and gives the cleaner look. If you skip this code, it gives the button a black border color. This line adds the rounded corner effect to the button. This property changes the mouse cursor to a hand icon when you hover over an element like a button. It indicates users that the element is clickable. This rule is used to change the appearance of a button when a user hovers over it. This line changes the background color of a button to darker shade of green. This part styles the body, which uses Arial font and a light blue background color. This part is for form container, which has maximum width of 400 pixel, centered with auto margins. It has white background, yellow border, rounded corners and a shadow. This part styles the heading, which is centered text with rich red color. These part style form elements. This thing styles the error message with red text of 12 pixel font size. And finally this part will style the buttons. Next, let's see the JavaScript code that implements client-side form validation. This part is form selection. This line selects the form element with the ID contact form and stores it in a variable form. Where is a keyword in JavaScript used to declare a variable. Here it is creating a new variable named form. The word document refers to the entire HTML document, that is web page. It is a built-in object in JavaScript that represents a web page. This part is a method of a document object which is used to find the HTML element on the page based on its ID. Contact form, this is the ID we are looking for. It should match the ID attribute of an element in the HTML document. So the whole line is searching for the entire HTML document for an element with an ID, contact form. And when it finds the element, it assigns to the variable form. After this line, form will contain a reference to your HTML form element. This line adds a listener to the form. When someone tries to submit the form, it will run the function inside. Form is a variable that was previously declared and assign the reference to the form element using this. This part is method of form element. It is used to attach an event listener to the form, which will run a function when a specific event occurs. Submit is the type of event that the event listener is listening for. So in this case, its submit event, it occurs when a form is submitted. That is when user clicks the submit button. This part is a function that will run when a submit event occurs. The function takes an event parameter which contains information about the event that triggered the function. So the code inside the function will be executed when the form is submitted. And this anonymous function is defined without any name. The function takes one parameter event, which is an object that contains information about the event that triggered the function. The event parameter is automatically passed to the function by the browser when the submit event occurs. Then the code inside the function will be executed when the function is called. So this whole line is attaching an event listener to the form element that listens for submit event. When the form is submitted, the function will be run and the code inside the function will be executed. This is the same event object that was passed to the function as a parameter. This is a method of the event object. It is used to prevent the default behavior of the event from occurring. In this case of submit event, the default behavior is to submit the form to the server. So when this is called, it prevents the form from submitting to the server. This means that form data will not be sent to the server and the page will not reload. Instead, it allows you to validate the form data and handle errors. In this line, document refers to the entire HTML document, that is the web page. This part is a method that finds the HTML element with the ID username error within the document. This sets the text content of username error element to empty string, which will clear any previous error message. This line is similar to the previous one, but it clears the error message for email field. Therefore, it selects an element with ID email error and clears its text content. This line clears the error message for terms field. It finds the HTML element with ID terms error and sets its text content to an empty string. So these lines clear previous error messages which are displayed for username, email and terms field. Next in this line, where username declares a new variable named username. Document refers to the entire HTML document. This part is a method that finds the HTML element with the ID username. Dot value retrieves the current value of the input field. Dot trim is a string method. It removes any white space characters from the beginning and end of a string. The resulting trimmed value is stored in the variable username. In JavaScript, dot operator is used for both accessing properties and invoking methods. That is, it allows you to access properties or methods of an object. In this case, it is used to access this method of an object, document. This is the method of document object. It is used to find and return an element in HTML document based on its ID. Document is a global object in JavaScript that represents the entire HTML document. It is the root node of document object model. So dot operator is necessary to call methods on objects. In this case, after accessing the value property, you have a string that is the user input and you want to call the trim method on that string. Without the dot operator, you will not be able to invoke this method on the string. So the dot operator before value is like saying get the value property of this input element. Similarly, dot before trim is like saying use the trim method on this string. In short, dot operator is creating a chain. It's getting the input element, then its value, and trimming that value. Each dot moves to the next step in this chain of operation. This line is similar to the previous one but for the email field. This part declares a new variable named email. This part finds the HTML element with ID email. This part retrieves the value of email input field and removes any leading or trailing white spaces. The trimmed email value is stored in the email variable. Here we declare a new variable named terms. This part finds the HTML element with ID terms, likely a checkbox. This property retrieves the current checked state of the checkbox. That is the boolean value true if checked, false if unchecked, which is stored in the variable terms. Therefore, the purpose of these lines is to retrieve the current values entered by the user in the form fields. The username variable will contain the entered username with extra space removed. The email variable will hold the entered email address also with extra space removed. The terms variable will be true if the user has checked the terms checkbox and false if they haven't. Next, we initialize validation flag. This line initialize a variable is valid to true. It is used to track if the form is valid overall. These codes validates 3 input fields: username, email and terms. It checks if each field meets certain conditions, and if not, it displays an error message and set a flag is valid to false. This part validate username. This line checks if the username variable is an empty string. If the condition is true, that is the username is empty, the code inside the if block will be executed. This part selects the HTML element with ID username error and assigns it to the variable username error. Typically, it is used to show an error message. This line sets the error message. This sets the text content of username error element to username is required. It informs the user to enter a username. Here the element is usually selected using the method like this. This part is a property of HTML element which sets or gets the text content of an element. This means you are updating the text content of this specific element to username is required. This line will add CSS class to HTML element. It will apply specific styles to the element. Here the username error will reference to an HTML element like a div or span. Here the username error is a variable which holds a reference to HTML element, specifically the span element with the ID username error. This element is used to display error message related to username input field. Class list is a property. This is a property of DOM elements that provides access to the elements list of CSS classes. It is an interface that allows you to add, remove or toggle CSS classes on an element. This is a method of class list object. It is used to add one or more CSS class names to the elements class list. And this is the name of the CSS class being added to the element. So this line of code is adding a CSS class named error to the element referenced by username error. By adding the error class, you are applying these styles to the element. This part will make sure the username is filled correctly. It is like raising a red flag. So this line indicates that the form cannot be submitted successfully due to empty username field. This part is email field validation. First it checks if the email variable is empty string, which means the user did not enter an email. If email is empty, it retrieves the HTML element with ID email error. Then it sets its text content to email is required and adds the error class to apply specific styles. And finally, is valid is set to false to indicate the form is not valid. This is second check. Here we use a function. It will check if the entered email is in a valid format. If the email is not valid, it will retrieve the HTML element with ID email error and updates its text content to please enter a valid email address. Then it adds the error class to apply styling. Finally, is valid is set to false. This part is terms agreement validation. This condition checks if the terms variable is falsy, which means that the user has not agreed the terms. And if the terms are not agreed, here it retrieves the HTML element with ID terms error and sets its text content to you must agree the terms. Then adds the error class for styling. Finally, is valid is set to false. Coming to this part, this condition checks if the isValid variable is true, meaning that all validation checks have passed. If the form is valid, this line shows a pop-up message which informs the user that the form has been submitted successfully. It then calls form submit to submit the form. And this is end of an event listener or function. This part is email validation function. This function uses a regular expression to validate email address. This function is used to check if an email address is in valid format. The function is defined using function keyword followed by function name validate email. It takes single parameter email which will validate email address. Inside the function, variable re is declared and assigned a regular expression pattern. The regular expression is enclosed within forward slashes. The regular expression consists of several components. These two represent the start and end of the string respectively. This part matches one or more characters that can be letters, digits, or any other special characters. So this part represents the username or local part of the email address. This symbol separates the username and domain. This part matches one or more characters that can be letters, digits, or special characters. It represents the domain name. Look at this part. This dot is a period, which is a special character, which means any character. For example, if you want to write a.b, this pattern will match anything like this. Here the dot can be replaced by any characters like 1, C, or space. What is backslash and dot? Here we are escaping the period. If you want to match a real period like dot in email address, you need to tell the computer, I mean the actual dot, not the wildcard. To do this, put a backslash before the period. So backslash dot means match a real period. In an email address, there is usually a dot before domain name, and when we write a regular expression to check if an email is valid, we need to make sure there is a real dot in email. For example, in an email address like example.com, you want to match the dot between example and com, and that's where the backslash comes in. So when you put backslash before the dot, it escapes the dot, making it a literal character. This will tell the regular expression engine to treat the dot as a normal character rather than a wildcard. Therefore, dot matches any single character and escaped dot matches a literal dot. This matches two or more letters representing the top level domain like .com, .org, or .edu. This part is a quantifier which makes sure the domain extension has at least two letters after the dot. And this is the validation logic. This method is called with the email parameter passed as an argument. The test method checks if the email string matches the regular expression pattern defined in RE. If the email matches the pattern, test returns true, indicating a valid email format. Otherwise, it returns false. Finally, the function returns the result of test method, which is either true or false, depending on whether the email matches the regular expression pattern or not. Now let's run this code. You can create a dynamic web page through this menu, or you can go to File, in that select New, in that select Dynamic Web Project, give project a name, set target runtime environment, click Next, and enable this checkbox. The XML deployment descriptor will provide structured standard way to configure and manage web applications. To be simple, it is an instruction manuals for web servers. Now click Finish. You can see the project is created. Now create HTML file. For that, right click the project. In that select New. In that choose HTML file. Name the HTML file. Click Next and Finish. Now you can see the HTML file is created. And here you can write the HTML code. Next, we need to create a CSS file. For that, right click the project, select New. In that, select CSS file. Name the CSS file. The CSS file name must match the name specified in HTML. And you can see the CSS file is created. You can write the code here. Now we need to create the JavaScript file. Right click the project, select New. In that, choose JavaScript file. Name the file as specified in HTML document. You can see the file is created. And you can write the code here. Now save all the files. Before you run the project, make sure the Tomcat server is running. To run this application, go to the HTML file, right click on it. In that, choose Open With and select Web Browser. This is the output. That's all for this session. Thank you so much.